Picture a nation born not of expediency and compromise but of furious insurgency, unremovable determination, and revolutionary fervor that ordinary men and women can shape their own fate. On the 4th of July, 1776, American colonies ratified more than a declaration of liberty. It was a revolutionary hope that monarchical chains could be cast aside and a new dawn could break. But it was no pageant imagined in solitary isolation. It was the culmination of centuries of misguided, global quest for power and naked hubris. There had been a decade-plus build-up of tensions in the 1760s and early 70s, in which the British Empire, strained to the breaking point by the expense of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in the colonies, was exacting undue taxation and authority over its North American colonies. Intelligentsia and pamphleteers like Thomas Paine ignited protest fires on the basis of grounds that, in addition to being taxed without representation, the colonies possessed inherent rights. Protest was converted to revolution on April 1775 when the Lexington and Concord battles opened the first shot for what was an undeclared war. In June 1776, philosophical disagreements crystallized in final action. Virginia's Richard Henry Lee caused the Second Continental Congress to vote for outright independence. That fateful speech and vote came on July 2nd, 1776. 12 colonies endorsed it, New York abstaining, severing political allegiance to the crown. John Adams, straining with pride over this new victory, saw Americans in the future celebrating on July 2nd their great national holiday. Alas, history had other plans. Between July 2nd and July 4th, a committee of 5, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston crafted an eloquent declaration explaining the colony's case for independence. Jefferson's draft, honed in seclusion, laid bare a powerful indictment of tyranny, genocide, and unowned privilege. Clock ticking, delegates debated and removed fiery passages, including one condemning King George III's endorsement of the slave trade. July 4th, the Continental Congress formally signed the Declaration of Independence, not a declaration of independence, but a declaration proclaiming a philosophical foundation for a new state. Mood careened wildly from joy and shock that night in Philadelphia. News traveled slowly in the colonies, but where it did, citizens welcomed it with bonfires, bells, parades, already, cannonades, and primitive fireworks of human nations John Adams had envisioned as an American hallmark. In Rhode Island and elsewhere, cities issued 13-gun salutes, a ceremonial welcome to the 13 unified colonies. Declaration of Independence did not guarantee attaining freedom, by hardly at all. British redcoats held the key ports from New York to Charleston. Revolutionary fighters, unpaid, unrationed, untrained, and unammunitioned, faced off against the world empire. But colonial determination, guerrilla war, local militia, and growing perception of solidarity started to drive the tide back. Most of all, diplomacy altered the terms. In 1778, France, encouraged by rivalry with Britain, openly joined sides with the Americans. Spanish assistance and Dutch loans were thrown in to add to the pressure as British forces strained in an unpopular world war. This world shock put the world on stage for one of history's greatest military operations. The play was not yet written, but it would all come into being years later, in a climactic Yorktown battle and Great Britain's ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, formally acknowledging American liberty. July 4th history is not history of one document, it's history of one world struggle, one great experiment that reshaped the future of one continent and the definition of freedom itself. Sitting down to sign the Declaration of Independence was revolutionary, but otherwise on the ground. It was simple enough to write about independence. Making it a reality wasn't simple. While copies of the Declaration were making the rounds in the summer of 1776, being read out in public squares and posted to church doorways, British warships were already in earnest off the coast of America. The British Crown was not about to relinquish its most profitable colonies without a fight. King George III viewed the Declaration as treasonous rebellion by traitors, and the entire force of the British war machine was unleashed. More than 30,000 British soldiers and German mercenaries, or Hessians, invaded New York in the largest 18th century seaborne invasion. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, was outnumbered, poorly trained and poorly armed. There were catastrophic defeats at Brooklyn, Manhattan, and New Jersey. Hope of victory was being withdrawn from them nearly as fast as it had been offered to them. What defined this war, however, was not military strength, it was determination. Washington's withdrawal from New Jersey, made legendary, was not as a victory, but as an act of determination in the face of apparently insuperable obstacles. Washington and his men, as a deliberate measure to boost morale, marched across the frozen Delaware River that December and surprised the Hessians at Trenton. The battle was small in magnitude, but gargantuan in significance. It showed that the revolution was not really dead. At the same time, politics within the war opened wide. France, having only recently been thwarted by losing North America a century before, could now shatter British hegemony. Diplomats like Benjamin Franklin worked day and night in Paris, selling the revolution as an international struggle against tyranny, not uprising against colonial occupation. French-American relations were formed in 1778, and French money, cartridges, and soon soldiers started flowing into the war. But they couldn't win. Skirmishes dragged on year after year, with each side reluctant to give the coup de grace. What had once been a tranquil American South became a bloody battlefield of guerrilla war, patriots and loyalists battling in civil war in the Revolution. Cities like Charleston were taken by the British, because the shoestring cash and out-of-pocket Continental Congress could not afford to keep the colonies as one. It did not fall until 1781. British General Cornwallis, attempting to establish a position in Virginia, was clinging at Yorktown. He had no knowledge the French and Americans were allies. In one of the most brilliant military moves, Washington led his army south, and the French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, blocked British reinforcements by sea. Yorktown's siege was a relentless and merciless one, and after the weeks-long bombardment, Cornwallis was compelled to surrender. The victory of Yorktown totally shattered British morale, although another 2 years of diplomatic maneuvering up to the Paris Treaty until the eventual acknowledgement of American independence in 1783. America was not born in hysterical ecstasy, but after years of struggle, austerity, and foreign coalition. The Paris Treaty of 1783 finally ended the American Revolutionary War. It was humiliating defeat for Britain, triumph for America. It proclaimed the 13 colonies free and independent states, and the United States their vast claims to foreign territory reaching overseas from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. But even as the treaty was signed, the troubles of this new nation was still in the balance. The war had united the people against a common enemy, but in peace came crashing in deep cleavages, economic devastation, and confusion regarding what independence was. For the commoner, most especially peasants, artisans, and merchants, freedom did not change life from day to day overnight. It wasn't years following the war when debt, inflation, and political turmoil ran life. Our first effort at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, was feeble and unsuccessful. States warred with one another for land, capital, and commerce, and the national government had no power to levy taxes or maintain an army. Promised union was at best shaky and subject to being cut by disunion at any moment. It was contested by many as well as by who this freedom was owing. The Declaration's rhetoric of bombast appealed to equality and inalienable rights, but beyond such declaration these were selectively met. The African slaves simply remained slaves, their status overlooked in the new republic. The native people, who had allied with the British in large measure as a means of retaining land, were pushed further out with westward moving settlers. Women, who had been so eminently in the forefront all along, were excluded from politics and denied rights by law. The revolution, whatever revolution this was far from entirely emancipating. Ultimately, however, the idea of July 4th was a more than political birthday. In the first celebrations, there were anything from solemn public readings of the Declaration to party parades and fireworks displays. By the beginning of the 19th century, Independence Day was a national holiday, a day when citizens could indulge in patriotism, pride, and protest at times. For abolitionists, for suffragists, and for labor activists, July 4th was the day to call the nation to account for what it claimed. Best known was Frederick Douglass's, who was an abolitionist and a former slave, In 1852, when he gave his influential speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" Douglas agreed that the revolutionaries had been courageous but pointed out the irony of a celebration of freedom in a country where millions were enslaved. His words challenged the nation to find a mean between its extremes, reminding that freedom was incomplete and unfinished business, not fait accompli. Additional history of July 4th reports American independence not to have been fait accompli nor assumed fact everywhere. Instead, it had been won by underhanded diplomacy, bloody struggle, foreign competition, and grassroots uprising. And over time, the date politicized from proclamation to cultural icon, a holiday to be celebrated and commemorative. The firecrackers, the barbecue, the patriotic airs are perhaps the last unmistakable vestiges of modern-day celebrations, but they cover a past of complication, of sacrifice, and of broken promise. As decades turned into centuries, July 4th kept pace with an ever-growing America. The new nation was frail, drained by political strife, sectional strife, and fear that the great experiment in liberty would decay from the corrupting effects of its own success. But when the new nation faltered, the legend of July 4th as the mythic birthday of liberty grew even more firmly ingrained in American life. In the 19th century, as westward expansion picked up steam, the 4th of July was given a new purpose. It was a ritual of unity for an expanding geographically, diversifying culturally, and expanding aspirational nation. Throughout the nation in cities and towns, Independence Day celebrations merged with entertainment and civic promotion. Political leaders, military parades, and marching bands were the de facto norm, as firework displays grew and became more expansive. To others, the festivities were a short respite from the bitter realities of everyday existence: poverty, worker oppression, and violent eviction of the native born. But under all the nationalist spectacle, July 4th also betrayed America's own domestic struggles. America was celebrating its freedom and self-rule ideals, but in doing so depriving those same freedoms to vast numbers of its own citizens. Slavery was still present in mid-1800s South, as millions suffered in brutal subjection. The 4th of July was a day of broken promise to African Americans. Blacks were not only barred from national celebration, but women were barred from the life of the nation, enlisting in support of the Revolutionary War in the form of spying, fundraising, even soldiering who wore men's clothing to conceal themselves. Women were deprived of citizenship and the right to vote. 4th of July orations on equality sounded hollow to those whose voices were being progressively stripped away. As tensions mounted, the July 4th symbolism was repeatedly invoked by reformers. Abolitionists invoked the day in order to use for dramatizing the gulf between American ideals and practice. The 4th of July was marched on by suffragists demanding women's suffrage in an unfinished revolution. Labor organizers marched the 4th demanding the exploitation of the laborious in a land professing to believe in freedom. Most prominently perhaps, what the July 4th most came to stand for was an event that occurred during the Civil War conflict which, in broad outlines, was America's second travail of self-making. When the Confederacy was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg by the Union early in July 1863, the battle came to be forever associated with Independence Day celebrations. Later in the months, Confederate stronghold city Vicksburg's capture on July 4th was a turning point for the war. 4th of July could no longer be enjoyed celebratory devotion to nationhood ideals and insistence upon seeing ideals first born in 1776 become a reality. When America emerged from the Civil War, battered but unshaken, July 4th had gained greater meaning. It was no longer a day to celebrate independence from England, but proof of this nation's capacity for disintegration and for healing. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the 4th of July became even more solidified as the culmination of American unity, even as there were struggles over freedom, equality, and justice. The Industrial Revolution came with swift economic urbanization, immigration, and unprecedented social change. Tens of millions were attracted to the shores of America with visions of liberation from poverty and oppression. Beguiled by the ideals of freedom, Independence Day ideals resound every July 4th. These immigrants too were relegated to the fringes, discriminated against, and exploited. To them, Independence Day was celebration and a poignant reminder that America's promises did not apply to them. July 4th and humanitarian wars was a mixed bag of emotions as well. World War I and World War II both saw the holiday observed with national pride, military parades, and demands for national unity. Soldiers who were fighting abroad took the cause of 1776 with them and encouraged citizens to treat their labors as part of the same fight for freedom. Propaganda speeches and orations suited the Founding Fathers, attributing 20th century wars to the revolution that had initiated them. American greatness worldwide grew, the more tensions it created within the nation. The 1950s and 60s civil rights movement re-exposed the hypocrisy of the July 4th holiday. According to African Americans and demonstrating against voting rights, protection under the law, and dignity, all whose greatest questions were how was it that a country that had been founded on freedom, so family could still continue to relive such institutionalized racism. Civil rights protesters marched by Independence Hall on July 4th, 1965, in symbolic rejection of the Declaration's cradle with the harsh reality of racial discrimination. The time of the Vietnam War further complicated the holiday. For some, July 4th was Revolutionary Patriotic Day. For others, the disconnect between American ideals and foreign policy. When protests marched down streets, the day traditionally set aside for harmony sometimes revealed schism. But with war, mythos of the Fourth persisted, manifesting itself in every altered definition of freedom with each successive generation. Today, however, the 4th of July is celebration and contemplation is celebration to commemorate revolutionary sacrifice for self-rule and a public reminder to review the work still to be done. The fireworks, parades, and barbecues diverge from its memory, but beneath celebration is a history of complexity, sacrifice, and work still to be done. To understand the real history of the 4th of July is to understand that independence was never a gift. It was protested, argued, brawled over, and reinterpreted ad infinitum. From protests in the colonies to global alignments, from military victory to fighting over civil rights, July 4th history isn't fixed, its past changes with each new episode of American life. In the end, real definition of independence isn't limited by what has occurred in the past, it is rendered by what a nation decides day to day.